Okay, now without further delay, let's get into Tom Notton.
Thank you. See if I can do that without kicking everything. Good morning, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
What?
So some of you read my blog?
Yes.
All right.
And your brother's blog.
So, and my brother's blog now, yes. So if you read my blog, you're probably aware that I'm a natural night owl. I usually write till 2, 3, 4 in the morning, sleep till almost noon. So I'd like to thank Jimmy for giving me the 9:30 spot this morning. I figure there's no chance of me catching stage fright up here, because by the time I wake up, I'll be done. I am delighted to be back on the low-carb cruise. It's my second year. I've been doing what I'm sure a lot of you have been doing. Hooking up with old friends, making some new friends, sucking my gut in as hard as I possibly can. Because I found out last year everything people carry these days has a camera in it. We have people making like Mata Hari, snapping pictures with their lipsticks. After last year, my wife was looking at all these pictures of me on Facebook, so I was standing there going, you know, a camera puts 10 pounds on you. She said, really? How many cameras did they use on you anyway? I think they had a whole press corps working a couple of these. So. Anyway, I am delighted to be back and to be presenting this morning's first topic, Science for Smart People. Now, I was originally going to call this Science for Dummies. I got thinking about it. I realized, you know what? Dummies really don't get science. It doesn't matter how clearly you explain it to them. Dummies are the people who believe Dr. Oz when he tells us that saturated fat is solid at room temperature, so it's solid in your arteries. I don't know what kind of heating and air conditioning unit Dr. Oz has at his house. At my house, room temperature is 70 degrees. I like to keep my arteries 28, 29 degrees warmer. Well, it so happened around the time Dr. Oz proposed this hypothesis, we had a 98-degree day in Tennessee. So I took some saturated fat, which was in fact solid at room temperature, and I set it outside for a while. Didn't stay solid very long. However, I repeated the experiment with some other foods that did stay solid at 98 degrees. So I'm not eating those anymore. I'll be darned if I'm going to get done in by a banana. Now obviously you know this is silly stuff because you're not dummies, you're smart people, but in my experience communicating with readers on my blog, even a lot of smart people are kind of intimidated by science and by scientists. Why? I think part of the answer lies in the wise and immortal words of teenage Barbie. You can't hear me? All right, you know, I may have to just hold this because it's awkward. There we go. Now, the truth is, if you are reading a study and you see math like this, most of us can end up feeling a little bit like teenage Barbie. Yeah, I have looked better, haven't I?
Dude, it's just as well you went bald. You look
Yeah,
better.
thank you. I made some bad hair choices back in the day. But what I want to convince you today is that you don't have to be capable of that kind of math to understand how science is supposed to work and to separate the good studies from the bad studies. You just need to have a logical mind and understand some basic principles. I think it's important that all of us do that, especially those of us who care about our health. Because it seems like every other day you're going to go online, you're going to open your newspaper, and you're going to see a headline that looks like this.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
And a couple days later, you'll see one like this. Then a couple days later, you'll see one like this, which will be followed by one like this, and maybe even one like this. Now Now, believe it or not, those first 4 all came from real headlines, which is why I think it's important for us to learn how these studies are conducted and what the data that comes from them actually means. So, what is science? Before we talk about that, I want to back up and talk about one of the basic features of human intelligence, which is pattern recognition, making connections between A and B. We had to be able to do this to survive as a species. We had to recognize quickly that if we drink from the clear moving water, we feel fine, but if we drink from the pond with the dead animals, we get sick. We had to recognize if we approach our prey from upwind, they will run away before we can catch them, but if we approach them from downwind, they do not. Pattern recognition is basic human intelligence. And that is why the teenagers in slasher movies always seem so incredibly stupid. They're out in the woods at Uncle Bob's cabin. Somebody hears a noise in the woodshed, goes to check it out, and disappears. Second one wonders what happened to the first one, goes to check it out, and disappears. Third one wonders what happens to those first 2, goes to check it out, and disappears. By the time the fourth one is heading out to the woodshed, we're all screaming, "What are you, some kind of moron?" Yes, not recognizing the connection between A and B. Now, teenagers notwithstanding, making connections between A and B is so hardwired into the human brain it can fool us. We can start to believe that every time we perceive a connection between A and B, that A must be causing B. This is what the psychologist James Alcock referred to as the belief engine. Our brains are constantly looking for connections between A and B, and if we spot them, we generate new beliefs about how the world works. But here's the fun part. When we are looking for these connections, we tend to latch on to the ones that are consistent with what we already believe, or at least do not contradict our previous beliefs. So let's watch the belief engine at work. We are back in Paleolithic times. It's the middle of a drought. We desperately need rain, but the sky god, who we all believe delivers the rain, isn't giving us any until one day 6 of us in a state of dehydrated delirium put on our festive clothes, start moving around, and invent the YMCA dance. Exactly. Sure enough, a little while later, it rains. Aha, we've spotted the connection. If we dance in festive clothes, it makes the sky god happy and he gives us rain. Maybe we go back 200-300 years, back in the times when we all believed that bad humor circulating in the body caused disease. One day a doctor decides to bleed a patient who was going to get better anyway. She does. Aha, we have spotted the connection. If we bleed the patient, we release the bad humors and the patient will be cured. This is how the belief engine works. Now, obviously, over time, people have come to realize that the belief engine can and will generate beliefs that are simply not true. This is where science comes in. So in fields like health, nutrition, and medicine, I like to think of science like this. Science is the process that allows us to objectively answer these questions. Is there really and truly a connection between A and B? If so, does A cause B to happen? Because there are other possibilities. And if so, how does A cause B to happen? And even if we don't know the answer to number 3, number 2 could still be true. There have been drugs, medicinal plants that worked without anybody understanding why. The way that scientists are supposed to answer these questions is by employing the scientific method. And I'm sure you all had this in high school, but let's do a quick review. Step 1, we make observations. We might gather data first so we can make observations. Step 2, based on our observations, we form a hypothesis. A hypothesis is just a possible explanation for what we've observed. For the hypothesis to move forward, it must be testable, which brings us to step 3. We conduct experiments. For those to be valid, they need to meet certain conditions, which we'll talk about. Step 4, we collect data from our experiments. And finally, based on a careful, thorough, objective analysis of our data, we reach a conclusion. We don't have anything resembling proof until we have gone through all these steps. And even then, the hypothesis is not validated unless the results of our experiments are consistent and repeatable. Now, this is a very important point. It is accurate to say that experiments are studies. It is not accurate to say that all studies are experiments. In fact, most of them aren't. In fields like health, nutrition, medicine, there are two types of studies: observational studies and clinical studies. A clinical study is an experiment. An observational study is not. An observational study is exactly what it sounds like. We are observing people. We're not treating them. We're not putting them on a diet. We're not putting them on a drug. We're observing people and gathering data. When we gather the data, what we hope to find are traits, behaviors, and results that seem to occur together. If they do occur together, we could say they are statistically associated, otherwise known as correlated, otherwise known as linked. In other words, we can say we've spotted a connection between A and B. If there is a connection between A and B, we could plot our data on a chart and show, for example, that smoking is associated with lung cancer, or that taking estrogen is associated with a lower rate of heart disease, or that being a Cubs fan is correlated with depression. And that one might be cause and effect, by the way. Now, there's a huge problem with observational studies, which we'll demonstrate with an example. Some large observational studies showed that parents who read to their kids and keep a lot of books in the house tend to have children who do better in school. Well, there you have it. A causes B, right? Reading to your kids makes them smarter, right? Wrong. Because when other researchers really looked into the data within the groups, the good students, bad students, mediocre students, they found the amount of time their parents had read to them and the number of books in the house made almost no difference whatsoever. So why would we see this strong correlation? Well, as it turns out, not surprisingly, intelligent people are more likely to enjoy books, to buy books, and to read books to their children. Intelligent people are also more likely to produce intelligent offspring who go on to do well in school because they're intelligent. This is something good scientists understand. Just because two traits are correlated, it does not mean one of them is causing the other. They can both be related to something else that the investigators were not looking for. That something else is called a confounding variable, and observational studies are full of confounding variables, and if the researchers aren't looking for them, they may not spot them. Remember the belief engine? When we're looking for those connections between A and B, we tend to latch on to the ones that don't contradict our previous beliefs. So let's do our own observational study and show how this might work. Here's our study population. 40% of my people are on a high-fat, high-sugar diet. 20% on a high-fat, low-sugar diet. 20% on a low-fat, high-sugar diet. The final 20% are on a diet low in fat and low in sugar. In other words, tasteless food. In other words, they're on the Ornish diet. So we gather the results from our observational study, and here's what we end up with. 3 people in the high-fat, high-sugar diet developed heart disease. 1 person in the low-fat, high-sugar diet developed heart disease. Now, what correlations am I going to pull out of this data? That could depend on what I'm looking for. Because the fact is, 2/3 of the people on a high sugar diet developed heart disease in my population. But if I have been conditioned to believe for my entire career that a high fat diet causes heart disease, I'm more likely to notice this correlation. In my high fat groups, half the people developed heart disease. But in my low fat groups, only 1/4 of the people developed heart disease. Well, I have spotted the connection. A high-fat diet causes heart disease. And in fact, based on my data, I could make this statement. A high-fat diet doubles your risk of heart disease. And in observational studies, you're going to see that term all the time. Doubles your risk, raises your risk, lowers your risk, like this one. Egg consumption may raise your risk of type 2 diabetes. So what does that term mean? Here's what a lot of people who don't know any better, including a lot of journalists, think it means. Let's suppose I watch The Deer Hunter one night. Afterwards, I decide it would be really cool to play Russian roulette. So I get out a 6-shooter. I put 1 bullet in the gun. What are the odds that I'm going to end up with a migraine? It's not a trick question. What are the odds? 1 out of 6, exactly. Now, suppose that didn't provide quite the adrenaline rush I was looking for. So, the next time I play, I put 2 bullets in my gun. Now, what are the odds I'm going to shoot myself in the brain and become a fan of the Dr. Oz show? 2 in 6. Yeah, 1 in 3, 2 in 6. I have literally really and truly doubled my risk, and it is a matter of cause and effect because my behavior has made it twice as likely that I'm going to shoot myself. So, a study like this comes along, raises your risk of diabetes, and the investigators, who are not being careful with their language, make statements like, the study showed a significant increase of new onset diabetes with regular egg consumption. They didn't even say associated with. This sounds like cause and effect. So naturally, people read this and they come away thinking that every time you eat some eggs, it is like putting more bullets in your gun. In an observational study, that is not what raising your risk means. In an observational study, raising your risk simply means that statistically you would be placed in one group instead of another group, and your group, on average, had a more negative outcome. But which group you belong to depends on how the investigators decided to slice and dice and analyze the data. Let's go back to our observational study. That's you, surrounded in yellow. If the researchers decide to slice and dice and analyze this data according to fat intake, you belong to a high-fat diet group, and according to my data, that raises your risk of heart disease. But if they decided to analyze the data by sugar intake, you're in the low sugar group, and according to my data, that lowers your risk of heart disease. Your diet cannot be causing heart disease and preventing heart disease at the same time. And frankly, since this is an observational study, we don't know. These are simply statistical categories. They don't tell us anything about cause and effect. Now, one more example of raising your risk before we move on. Girls who quit high school are much more likely to end up as pregnant teenagers than girls who don't. So statistically, quitting school raises your risk of becoming pregnant. Does anybody think quitting school makes you pregnant? Anybody had a pregnant teenager come home and said, "Oh my God, she must have quit school"? No. I mean, if that's how it works, a whole lot of us need to go back to high school and retake biology. And stay away from the potential dropouts while you're there, please. This is why good scientists have a saying, correlation does not prove causation, because an observational study only brings us to here. Best an observational study can do is provide evidence for a hypothesis. It is not proof. That is, I have no idea what that was. That is why when good scientists are looking for something like proof, they conduct a clinical study. Clinical studies are the gold standard in research. They're the kind that really matter. Why? Because you can control your variables. In a typical clinical study, we'd put together 2 or more groups of people who are statistically the same, which is obviously important because if we were going to test, say, a heart medication and one group was full of smokers and the other group wasn't, we know the smokers are going to skew the data. So in a clinical study, we want to balance our groups according to things like race, age, gender, socioeconomic status, previous health history, everything we can think of, and then with those variables balanced and controlled, we would change one variable. One group goes on a diet, the other group doesn't, or they go on different diets. Or one group takes a drug, the other group takes a placebo. Neither group knows what they're getting. Then, because we controlled our variables, if one group has a statistically different outcome, we can be pretty sure changing the variable made the difference. I want to give you an example, a real-life example of why good scientists don't jump to conclusions based on observational studies. For decades, researchers have been pulling data out of a large observational study called the Harvard Nurses Study. And one of the correlations they found was one I mentioned earlier. Middle-aged nurses who took estrogen had a 40% lower risk of heart disease. Oh my God, what a fabulous finding. And there were bad doctors and bad scientists ready to run out and prescribe estrogen to every middle-aged woman on the planet. The good scientists said, hang on a second, correlation does not prove causation. We need to do a clinical study. So they did. It was a big clinical study, 16,000 women involved. It lasted 5.5 years. Here were the results. Women who took estrogen ended up with a 30% higher rate of heart disease. They also had more strokes. There was another clinical study later that produced pretty much the same results. Now, how could this be? If estrogen does not protect against heart disease, why would an observational study show us that taking estrogen lowers your risk of heart disease by 40%? Health-conscious people are different from the population as a whole. Compared to the general population, they are less likely to smoke, less likely to drink too much, less likely to consume sodas, candies, and other forms of junk. They are more likely to exercise, get enough sleep, take vitamins, go see a doctor if they think there's something wrong. In other words, estrogen was not giving these women healthier hearts, but health-conscious women were more likely to take estrogen and have lower rates of heart disease because they were health conscious, and their better health habits more than offset the effects of the estrogen, which was not good for their hearts. So, observational studies, clinical studies. Most of what you see in the media reported are observational studies. So, you open up your newspaper, go online, you see new study says X, Y, or Z is going to kill you. What do? Go find the study. If you're reading online, you can probably find a link directly to the study. If not, I like to take the investigator's name, the name of the journal where the study was published, a couple of keywords, punch that into Google Scholar, run a search. That will usually bring up an abstract. A lot of times if you open the abstract, you can even find a link to the full text of the study. Now at this point, what a lot of journalists do is they skip ahead, they glance through the study, then they read the conclusions that the investigators wrote, and they go out and they write their story based on those conclusions. We don't want to do that. We want to apply some critical thinking. Why? Because we understand and respect one of the oldest and proudest traditions in science, which is scientists are freaking liars. Latin term, freakinitis Pinocchiotis. Now, I'm not saying all of them. I'm not even saying most of them, but if you read books like Voodoo Science, Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me, Ignore the Awkward, or of course, Good Calories, Bad Calories, you will soon notice that the freakinitis Pinocchiotis is a much more common species than any of us would like to think. It so happens a little while ago the Atlantic Monthly magazine published a big article on exactly that topic, lies, damn lies, and medical science. Dr. John Ioannidis has spent his career challenging his peers by exposing their bad science. Dr. Ioannidis is a Harvard MD, also a mathematical genius, and he has spent a lot of time studying studies. I'll give you a couple of key quotes. He and his team have shown again and again and in many different ways that much of what biomedical researchers conclude in published studies, conclusions that doctors keep in mind when they prescribe blood pressure medication or when they advise us to consume more fiber or less meat, is misleading, exaggerating, and often flat out wrong. He charges that as much as 90% of the published medical information that doctors rely on is flawed. When it came to cancer, heart disease, and other common ailments, there was plenty of published research, but much of it was remarkably unscientific, based largely on observations. 80% of the conclusions drawn from non-randomized studies, those are observational studies, turn out to be wrong. Dr. Ioannidis also says 20 to 25% of the conclusions from clinical studies are wrong. How could that be? Probably has something to do with this. Researchers were frequently manipulating data analyses, chasing career-advancing findings rather than good science, and even using the peer review process to suppress opposing views. That is why when we are looking at a study, we want to ask some critical thinking questions. First critical thinking question, pretty obvious, is this an observational study or a clinical study? If it's an observational study, that doesn't mean it's worthless, but we need to recognize we are only here. Step 2 out of 5. The investigators can tell us they've spotted a connection between A and B, and that's it. So the next critical thinking question, if A and B are linked, could it be because of C? Such as the kids who grow up in homes with a lot of books and go on to do well in school because they were born to intelligent parents, or nurses who take estrogen and have healthier hearts because they are health conscious. Here's an example of a study where somebody should have asked that question. This observational study showed that women who engage in regular exercise have a 30% lower risk of endometrial cancer. Now, I fully expected the average media reporter to assume that A was causing B. Unfortunately, in this case, so did the lead investigator. Here's what he wrote. We already knew that maintaining a healthy body weight is an important way to reduce the risk of womb cancer, but our study showed that physical activity has a protective effect of its own. Do we see the problem here? This is an observational study, but the researcher has already decided he's seen cause and effect. Exercise is producing the lower rate of cancer. Now, maybe it does, but this is an observational study and it can't tell us that. It could simply be that health-conscious women are more likely to exercise and also have a lower rate of cancer for any number of reasons. Next critical thinking question. If we are told that A is linked to B, could it be that B is causing A? A couple of months ago, I had a big online debate with someone who claimed to be a PhD in science, and he told me, Tom, you big moron, of course running makes people thinner. Go to a marathon sometime and tell me how many fat people cross the finish line. Okay, A must cause B. If runners are thin, running must make you thin, right? Well, when I was in high school, the guys on the basketball team were pretty tall. In college, they were taller. In the NBA, they're really tall. The obvious conclusion, playing basketball makes you taller. And the longer you play, the taller you will be. I decided to test that one for myself. I started out at 5'11". Then I started playing basketball 3 hours a day. A year later, I was 6'4". Basketball players are tall because being tall makes you more likely to succeed at basketball. The fact that competitive runners are thin doesn't tell us anything, except perhaps that being thin makes it more likely that you'll take up running. Here is another example of getting the causality backwards. I've seen a lot of stupid articles over the years bashing the Atkins diet. This one might take the cake. A low-carb diet may make you fat. How did they know this? Because an observational study showed that people who restrict their carbohydrates are fatter on average than the population as a whole. Well, there you have it. A must cause B. A low-carb diet will make you fat. I can think of a different explanation. See the good-looking guy there? Not me, the good-looking one. That's my son Zach, who does not count his carbohydrates, or his calories, or his fat grams, or anything. Why? He has no desire to lose weight. What kind of person goes on a weight loss diet of any kind? A fat person. I'm pretty sure if we went to a Weight Watchers meeting, the people there would also be fatter on average than the population as a whole. In fact, I know they would, because at one of their meetings, new study shows Weight Watchers may damage your floors. Next critical thinking question. If a scientist says A is causing B, do we see A linked to B consistently? Or do we see these glaring exceptions across different populations? We have all been told, for example, that a diet high in saturated fat is linked to heart disease. Yep, that's true. Unless, of course, you are French, Swiss, the Inuits, the Maasai tribesmen, Spanish, or a whole lot of other populations we'll call paradoxes. We have been told that red meat is linked to colon cancer, and it is, except in several studies where it wasn't, including this one from Oxford University, which showed the incidence of colorectal cancer was higher in vegetarians than in meat eaters. If they're, well, we're not cheering for them to get cancer, but we just, yeah. In the book Voodoo Science, the author wrote about the big scare that power lines were causing cancer. You remember that? Yes. Now, when this was hitting the news, he tried to convince journalists and make them understand that correlation does not prove causation. It could simply be that poor people are more likely to live near power lines, and they have higher rates of cancer for all kinds of reasons. And he wrote that he was stunned at how many journalists could not understand that concept. They thought if A and B were connected, one had to be causing the other. What finally made that big scare go away was a glaring exception, an observational study of tens of thousands of electrical workers who worked on those lines, up close and personal every day with, this supposedly dangerous level of electromagnetism, and they, as it turned out, had lower rates of cancer than the population as a whole. When this stupid story hit the news, I went looking for a glaring exception. Took me about 3.5 minutes to find it. The red line shows rates of diabetes in the US shooting up over the past few decades. The blue line shows that egg consumption was going down over the same period. Next critical thinking question. In a clinical study, Who were the subjects, and does it make sense to transfer their experience to the rest of us? And I ask that because this one hit the news a few weeks ago, how fatty foods lead to diabetes. Junk food inflammation may trigger diabetes. Statements like this from the investigators. These results support the idea that inflammation plays a role in chronic disease, and the simple message is to avoid fatty foods as much as possible. So I checked out this study, and it turns out, unfortunately, a diet high in saturated fat does seem to produce inflammation in this section of the population. Now you know why the mice who kill and eat cows and pigs have so many health problems. Now, I'm not saying animal studies are worthless, but when investigators feed a diet to an animal that is completely unnatural for the animal, I don't care what the results are. I don't care if T. Colin Campbell can produce cancer in rats by feeding them an isolated dairy protein, because most rats don't milk cows. The ones who do don't have the technology to separate the proteins. Next critical thinking question, what was the actual difference? Now, as we saw earlier, math class is tough, but basic concept here I want to go over because I think it's important. In mathematics, difference has a specific meaning. It's the result of subtraction. 103 minus 102 is 1. That's the difference. If the difference is not an impressive number, sometimes your freakinitis Pinocchiotis will switch to division to calculate the relative difference, which tends to be a more impressive number. Absolute change, the difference, is subtraction. Relative change is division. Let me give you a famous example of how this works. The Lipitor trials were conducted on large groups of men who were already at high risk for heart disease. After 10 years, here were the results. In the Lipitor groups, 2 out of every 100 men suffered a heart attack. In the placebo group, just over 3 out of every 100 men suffered a heart attack. So the difference is about 1 heart attack for every 100 men. In other words, if you took 100 men who had multiple risk factors for heart disease, you gave them this drug for 10 years, you would, in theory, be preventing 1 heart attack out of that group of 100. That's not an impressive number. So let's apply the magic of division and calculate the relative change. Here's the equation. Take the smaller number, divide by the bigger number, subtract that from 1. That gives you the relative change as a decimal. So Lipitor, 2 divided by just over 3 equals 0.64. Subtract that from 1. We get 0.36. We can now plaster the universe with ads claiming that Lipitor reduces your risk of heart attack by 36%. Which gives most people the impression that more than 1/3 of the men taking this drug are saving themselves from a heart attack. No, it's 1 in 100. Maybe. If you're a man under 65 who already was at high risk for heart disease. A lot of times in studies you'll see this word, significant. Significant results, significant difference, significant increase, significant decrease. That's an impressive sounding word, isn't it? A couple of months ago, one of my blog readers asked me about my salt intake. I replied, I really don't care about my salt intake. For the vast majority of the population, salt has a tiny, tiny effect on blood pressure, so I don't worry about it. Once again, that drew an angry response from Mr. PhD in science, who told me, you clearly haven't done the research. Follow this link to a major clinical trial in which the investigators were able to produce a significant reduction in blood pressure by restricting salt. So what does that word mean, significant? Let me put it to you this way. Suppose I talked you into doing aerobics for 45 minutes a day, 5 days a week for a solid year. And at the end of that year, you had lost a whopping 4 pounds of body fat. Would you jump up and down, call your friends and say, hey, I did aerobics for a year and man, did I experience some significant weight loss? No? What if I could convince you that I was more than 95% sure that the only reason you lost the 4 pounds was because you did the aerobics for a year? Then would you consider that a significant weight loss? No, because for most of us, significant means something like impressive or meaningful or important. That is not what it means to a scientist. To a scientist, significant simply means based on tried and true statistical formulas. We're more than 95% sure the results we saw were not due to chance. That's all it means. So let's go back to the study Mr. PhD in science insisted should convince me that salt causes hypertension. Investigators put a large group of people on something like the Mediterranean diet, but with a very high intake of salt, and then they measured their blood pressure a few weeks later. Then they switched them to the same diet with a very, very low intake of salt. After a few weeks, they measured their blood pressure. Here were the significant results. On the high salt diet, the average blood pressure was 126/81. On the very, very low salt diet, average blood pressure 123/79. Now, the investigators were more than 95% sure that this tiny reduction in blood pressure was caused by restricting salt, so these results are significant. But as far as proving that salt causes hypertension, they're meaningless. Moral of the story, if a scientist introduces you to his significant other, just means he's pretty sure he's not dating her by accident. Next critical thinking question, did the researchers control the variables? We talked about why this is important in a clinical study. It's also important in an observational study. Let me give you an example why. Suppose I told you, according to my data, that people who consume high levels of gin, vodka, water, and other clear liquids are more likely to have liver damage. Would you have a problem with that? Yes, one of these things is not like the other. It doesn't belong in that group. Same thing here when we were told recently that red meat is linked to colon cancer. There's a nice picture of red meat. Just one little problem. To make that correlation stick, they had to put red meat in the same group as processed meat. And the processed meats included foods like pizza, hot dogs, deli sandwiches, and burritos. In other words, processed meats that people typically consume with a big serving of white flour. When other researchers separated the red meat from the processed meat, there was no connection with colon cancer. Next critical thinking question, compared to what? You will see this story in some form or another over and over. Whole grains prevent diabetes, whole grains prevent heart disease, whole grains prevent obesity, whole grains stop worldwide financial collapse, you name it, whole grains can prevent it. And every time I go and check out one of these studies, it's the same thing. They are comparing people who consume whole grains to people who consume white flour. Does that prove whole grains prevent anything? No. Let me give you an example why. Suppose I compared people who smoke unfiltered cigarettes to people who smoke filtered cigarettes. When people with filtered cigarettes turn out to have a lower rate of cancer, could I make this statement? No. Because the filtered cigarettes are not preventing cancer. They are just less likely to cause it. Same thing here. If they want to prove whole grains prevent disease, they need to compare people who eat whole grains to people who eat no grains whatsoever. And our final critical thinking question, do the results of the study actually support what the investigators put in their conclusions? You'd be surprised how often they don't. Remember the example I gave earlier, 45 minutes of aerobics, 5 days a week for a solid year, average fat loss 4 pounds after a year. That's from an actual clinical study. And here's what the investigators wrote. Provides direct empirical evidence that previously sedentary, mostly overweight, postmenopausal women can achieve and sustain high levels of aerobic exercise that result in statistically significant reductions in all measures of adiposity. Yeah, significant, maybe. Maybe a year's worth of aerobics produced that tiny, tiny change in weight. But as far as proving that exercise will make you lose weight, obviously this is meaningless. The salt study, Mr. PhD in science insisted I should read. Drastic reduction in salt leads to a tiny reduction in blood pressure. Here's what the investigators wrote in their conclusions. Our results provide support for a more aggressive target for reduced sodium intake. I don't even know what that could mean. I guess if people have high blood pressure, we smack them and hope it goes down. This is meaningless. This is one of my all-time favorites. This was a clinical study in which the investigators put one group of people on a low-carb, high-fat diet. Another group of people were on a low-fat, moderate-carb diet. There was a control group. Their diet didn't change. Here were the results. The low-carb and low-fat groups both lost weight, but the low-carb group lost more actual body fat, and they showed the greatest improvements in all cardiovascular markers, including total cholesterol, triglycerides, HDL, and LDL. Low-carb diet, clearly the winner, so of course this is what the investigators wrote. Moderate approaches to weight loss, such as a moderate carbohydrate, low-fat diet, may be prudent. By prudent, I guess they meant we would like to continue receiving research grants from Kellogg's, who funded this study. That is why we need to ask those critical thinking questions, because scientists are freaking liars. And we need to call them on it, all of us, the bloggers, the podcasters, the filmmakers, the concerned public. And the great thing about living in the digital age, we can call them on it. We can do it publicly. And I know some of them pay attention, because twice in the last year I have had scientists leave angry comments on my blog that, yes. And their comments basically amounted to, you have no business questioning me because I'm a PhD and you're not. To which my reply basically boiled down to, if you're going to put that kind of garbage out there and call it science, I'll not only question you, I'll make fun of you. And you have no business questioning that, because I'm a comedian and you're not. Thank you very much. Thank you, James. So you are a reproductive endocrinologist.
Right. That's
Okay.
different than medical endocrinology.
In what way?
We do reproductive medicine, infertility, and we're trained in an OBGYN track as opposed to internal medicine.
Okay. Anyway, the reason I wanted to do this interview, I have a slide which I'll probably put up when I'm discussing this about the HERS study, H-E-R-S study. Clinical study, women took estrogen, they ended up with a higher rate of heart disease. And then you told me later there's a lot more to that story than that. And what we don't want to do is to be discouraging women from taking estrogen.
Really, all the trials that have been done to date, except for some smaller studies, look at oral estrogen. So if you already have your plaque developed in the vessel, meaning you already have a partial occlusion, and then you take oral estrogen, which is clearly known to raise your clotting factors, we've known for years that that would create a higher incidence of clotting, whether it be stroke, heart attack, clotting in people's legs, pulmonary embolus, all of which, sort of the same clotting mechanism. I think the real issue is for patients that we see that come to our practice, they present at the time of menopause, and so many of these studies looked at patients that either already had their heart disease, and so they were at risk for clotting, and if you make them more clotting, higher clotting tendency, then they're much more likely to have a clot. Or if they're postmenopausal for at least 2 or more years, they've probably already seen a pretty dramatic increase in their plaque formation just because they didn't have estrogen around anymore. So those two factors really played a role in showing an increase in clotting issues in all the studies that are out there. About the time WHI came out, the HERS trial, we were really all starting to think and move more in a transdermal or non-oral estrogen route. So when you take an oral pill, it's dissolved in the gut, all the blood flow goes right into the liver. The liver is what makes the clotting factors, and estrogen is clearly known to increase hepatic protein production, one area which is the clotting factors. So if you give the estrogen through the skin or other routes that are non-oral, the estrogen is absorbed and distributed systemically, so the liver actually doesn't see that high dose of estrogen, and you don't get the same increase in clotting factors. I think ultimately what all these studies have has sort of shaken out is the fact that if you're going to start hormones, you're going to get a dramatically higher benefit if you start it at or before menopause rather than waiting a few years after menopause. Most women, if they're going to go through menopause at an average age of 51, would start to have symptoms in their early to mid-40s. And those symptoms might be rather subtle. It might be headaches, mood changes, some changes in their skin, maybe night sweats or even hot flashes. And at that point, some low-level estrogen replacement could be very helpful. But certainly if estrogen is started at menopause, we see a big benefit.
In terms of overall health, heart health?
I would argue, and it is a debatable point, but I would argue that you see really almost every body system is improved with estrogen replacement.
Okay.
Another area that's been well characterized is bone loss. And so if you look at a postmenopausal woman, we all know estrogen helps with bone health and bone density. Most of the studies show in the first 2 years of menopause, you lose 80% or so of the bone that you're going to lose the rest of your life. So that's a very critical period right at menopause. And probably similar for heart health, brain function, and other metabolic issues, that once you get pretty far down the road, you can't really reverse it so much. Again, the data that looks at transdermal estrogen, the non-oral route, shows no increase in clotting. The other sort of metabolic factor that estrogen is negative toward is triglycerides. There's an elevation in triglycerides.
Okay.
But the non-oral route, again, shows no difference in triglycerides. So a lot of the studies that were done, including going way back, all used oral medicine because that was the common practice at the time, but we now have new delivery systems.
And there are fewer side effects, negative side effects.
Right.
All right, so the bottom line is don't be afraid of the estrogen.
That's right.
It can
Take
be-
your hormones.